Hello, and thank you for joining us. We're going to begin the presentation in about a minute. We're just going to give everybody a chance to log in. Thanks. Hello, and thank you for joining us. If you just joined us, we are giving everyone just one more minute here to log in, and we're going to begin the presentation. Thanks. All right, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Miro Consulting webinar on Azure Cost Management. My name is Sean Donahue, and I'm the VP of Marketing and Lead Salesforce Analyst at Miro Consulting. I'll be your moderator for today's event. Our presenter today is Tim Hegedus, Director of Technical Services and Microsoft Practice Manager. If you have any questions during the broadcast, please use the chat box, and we will answer them at the end of the session. We'll try to take the questions in the order that we receive them, and if we don't have time to answer your question, we'll get back to you after the webinar and on an individual basis. So before we begin, I'd like to briefly explain who Miro is. Miro Consulting is a leading global provider of software asset management and subscription management services for Oracle, Microsoft, IBM, Adobe, and Salesforce. We specialize in license management, audit advisory, negotiation tactics, support management, and cloud services. Our mission is to help our clients maximize their ROI on software license and subscription investments, stay in compliance, and negotiate successful contract and audit settlements. Now, I just want to point out, Miro Consulting is not a Microsoft partner. So we have no contractual obligations to report on our clients to Microsoft like Microsoft partners have. If you would like an independent, confidential review of your Microsoft software solutions and cloud environment, please contact us after the webinar. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tim to begin the presentation. Tim?
Thank you very much, Sean, and welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. And I hope that you are doing well in these difficult times. So let's start off our agenda, our presentation for today with an agenda. And let me start off by saying that from Computer World magazine, some of you may be familiar with that, back in February of 2019, they conducted a survey, and 58% of those respondents said they overspent on their budget for cloud services. Within that group, 69%, that's 69%, said that they overspent by more than 25%. Now that's 25 cents on every dollar. And that's $25,000 for a $100,000 spend, or $250,000 on $1 million spend, and that is an annual figure. So that all adds up to a lot of wasted money, a great deal of wasted money, and very, very quickly. And for every organization who already manages Azure, or Azure if you prefer, quite capably, there are multiple others who do not. And it is these organizations that collectively raise that average. So we're here today to show you ways in which you can get a handle on your Azure spend and possibly even reduce it. In doing that, we're going to be talking about these topics. We'll start off talking about basic monitoring tools, right, including some free ones within Azure itself. Then we'll go on to areas of cost management, areas where you will want to focus in order to reduce your Azure spend. And then finally, we'll address some best practices for administering the Azure environment. Now, the individuals who are responsible for paying the bills, including, I'm only focused on Azure, so it would be the individual who is responsible for paying the bills for Azure. That is a good starting point. And since it is billed on a monthly basis, this person or these people will be aware that the cost has risen for Azure. And now this information comes from the Azure account portal and through optional email communications. Okay. Now, should that cost rise, perhaps to a prescribed level without abating, also perhaps within a prescribed time frame, then a notification can be sent to the appropriate parties. Right? Now, recognize that the damage here would have already been done. In other words, since the billing is done in arrears, the cost would have already been borne by that organization. So this is therefore a reactive control, to use an audit term. Nevertheless, it represents a very good starting point. Now, Azure provides reporting designed to detail its usage, including the rate, the amount consumed, and the other information by metric. Right? Now, we need to emphasize this last point, by metric. The usage reports involve each metric. Okay? And some Azure resources involve multiple metrics. For example, a particular virtual instance might involve not only its series, what is referred to as series or performance characteristics, but also the storage it uses, such as for the database, the quantity of transactions, data transfer, and more. Okay, so for this reason, these usage reports can be massive, right? And a lot of that size depends on the date range and the amount of metrics involved. So what Miro recommends is that this data be made more readable by parsing it. Okay. Now, there are some capabilities within Azure, okay, or included with Azure for as no fee management tool. The first listed here is cost management. Cost management is visibility into how Azure instances are being used. It includes a history of the organization's spend that ought to be reconciled within and with the organization's own records. Now, this information becomes very, very important during the budget planning phases. The second one is subscriptions. For organizations making use of Azure subscriptions, these can act as something of an early warning system for expenses because unexpected costs can be quickly identified. And by the way, Microsoft defines Azure subscriptions as a set of resources that entail the same way of paying. Okay, so it's an Azure resource that is a pay-go model is a subscription. An Azure resource that is a committed resource would be another subscription. Now, there are also ways to control costs proactively by engaging with a managed service provider. Right? Microsoft refers to these as cloud service providers or CSPs. Now, we can't go into the details, but we will say that many CSPs allow for turning off those instances and or that capacity when it is no longer needed. Like for example, in the retail vertical, additional capacity might be necessary around the end of the year, but that same capacity would become superfluous after and before that period. So many CSPs allow for this short-term use, and that in itself can save some money. In a nice segue, we'll now explore where you can get the biggest bang for your buck. Right? But before we delve into those areas, let me explain that Azure-based instances are not the same as on-premise instances. When you spin up an instance or two or three for a specific purpose, perhaps to resolve a production issue, and then forget about them after the dust settles, there's typically a no harm, no foul for those on-premise deployments, right? But in Azure, that's different because running instances can be chargeable. That is one reason why careful, deliberate management of the Azure environment is so important. One might say purposeful management of that environment. In other words, when there is an Azure instance to be spun up, it must have a defined purpose and a defined timeline. Okay? All of the areas now that you see on that slide fall into the category of cost management. There are areas in which the cost of Azure instances can be managed and they can be explained. Tracking, for example, is the regular checkpoint for reviewing what instances are running. Okay, something that you are probably already doing. But more than that, whether they are simply stopped or whether they are deallocated, and the difference is cost. There are fees for a stopped instance in Azure which do not accrue for the deallocated instances. So there's a financial difference. But there's also a technical difference. First, it could take some additional time for a deallocated instance to be restarted. Perhaps more importantly, the statefulness, right? Some of the more technical folks out there understand what that means. The statefulness of the instance could be lost when the deallocation occurs. So for some instances, either of those cannot be tolerated, so the decision is made to simply stop them. But in doing so, simply stopping them translates into additional spend. Now, procedures defines this tracking. Who is to do it, how often, and what he or she must do with that information. In other words, the protocols associated with managing the Azure environment. There are also some third-party tools available. Some of these take the form of tools at various price points. Some others involve a solution provider, such as the CSP, which we discussed earlier. Now, some of our audiences are familiar with some of these concepts. Okay? Consider this something of a refresher, if that is true, but it also serves as an introduction for some newer subscribers to Azure. Now, listed before you are some instant triggers that might be used to help rein in the cost of Azure instances. The first is called auto shutdown, and it allows for an Azure instance to be stopped and deallocated at the prescribed time. Right? This is often used for development purposes or for demonstration purposes. Now, if you are architected in such a manner that you've isolated development from production support, the use of Azure Dev Test Labs can help reduce the cost associated with that development environment because it is free. Okay? Now, when we speak of sizing or right sizing, we refer to the configuration, right? The configuration of the Azure instance. For the very same reason that VM sprawl affects cost management, so does improperly sizing those instances. When you have over-allocated an on-premise resource, it is not the same as having over-allocated an Azure resource. These different instances have different fees, again, money, right? So the cost management service, which can provide that utilization information, becomes very, very, very important. Now, there are some other methodologies that might be considered as well, right? Serverless computing, right, which allows for certain applications to run virtually and on demand, and that is versus having an instance running for them all the time. Okay, segregating resources involves a deliberate separation of, say, storage from compute. Right? In such a situation, that would allow for the constant storage fees, right, while incurring compute fees only when necessary. Okay, something important to remember. So thresholds, finally, speak to limitations on Azure instances for subscriptions, evaluations, and other services that are credit-based. Okay. Now, I wanted to point out that this webinar is essentially about overall cost management of Azure. It is not about the technical underpinnings of Azure. So what we want to do is tell our audience that these are, in fact, ways in which that Azure environment can be managed in a cost-effective manner. Okay. Now, before we go, we wanted to share yet another cost reduction possibility. Early last month, May, Microsoft announced a new policy whereby existing Azure subscriptions under an enterprise agreement can be transferred to that cloud service provider or CSP. Okay. Now, there are constraints, right? That the CSP must be certified as a Azure Expert Managed Services provider, and the acceptance by you of the Microsoft Customer Agreement, or MCA, are two of those very restrictive constraints, right? But this approach may afford you some more immediate cost reductions. There's a caveat, however. Obviously, there's a caveat. You want to be aware that if the pricing for Azure is tied to the agreement, right? In other words, the enterprise agreement uses Azure to reach a certain level. An enterprise agreement is a form of a commitment, right? And you have made that commitment based on Azure. Well, then that enterprise agreement could be repriced, that is, made more expensive, if that action takes on a brand new level. So you just want to be aware of that. So with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Sean to open the floor for questions.
Thanks, Tim. And I'll just remind our audience that when it comes to your Microsoft reseller, their job is to sell you more, not sell you less. And if they find you're out of compliance, they will report you to Microsoft. So again, if you would like a confidential Microsoft review or find out how you can spend less, you can contact us at Miro. We are not a Microsoft partner. We are not a reseller. We have no contractual obligations, and we do not tell them anything. So before we start with questions, Tim, why don't we start with the questions that we received during the registration process, and then we'll go to the audience questions after that.
Sure thing. The first question that I have here, and I'm kind of reading at this stage, so please bear with me. We recently read where there is a surge in Azure usage. What have you seen? Well, back in the first quarter of this year, of 2020, Microsoft was the only organization in the Dow Jones Industrial Average to come out ahead by exactly 1 penny, right? Not bad considering market performance. However, Microsoft also reported a 775 increase in demand for cloud services during that same period, right? So I would have to agree with that position. Do we have any others? Any other questions? If not, there are some more registration questions.
Yes, Tim.
This one is.
Might as well keep. Go ahead, Tim. Keep with
Okay.
the registration questions for now. I'll let you know if we have time. If we have time after the registration questions, we'll get to the audience questions.
Okay, great. The next one, very good question. It says, are we really going to have? Okay, I'm reading this incorrectly. Is Azure really going to result in cost savings? Right? Well, I don't think we'd be running this webinar if that were entirely and only true, right? Azure is a subscription versus the perpetual right to use, that pervades the on-premise environment. So at some point, those lines are going to cross regardless of the disposition of software assurance. So right off the bat, a subscription lasts forever, whereas perhaps some of the perpetual licensing does not. What muddies the water is how that cost is calculated, though. Now, there might be savings in the costs of technical resources, right? But maybe not. There might also be costs included in those technical resources or the people, where that savings might not come to fruition because there is still an environment on premise, just as for those hybrid environments, right? Or those resources, those people have changed their roles from being a hands-on technical person to being more of a relationship manager. Another upfront cost that I can think of is the network, right? Now, typically a network is architected for a large portion of the workload to be performed inside of it, inside of the firewall, that is. I personally had a client who halted their move to the cloud because of the costs of re-architecting their network to accommodate a large portion of the workload to be done outside of it, outside of that firewall. So, in conclusion, I would say it's some funny math. It's certainly better for the cloud service providers. It's certainly better for Microsoft. Whether it's better for you depends on how you calculate the cost savings.
Yeah, and I'll jump in there, Tim. One of the things we found is that what we've looked at when we looked at our clients who've moved versus some of our clients who've stayed, and a lot of our clients are doing what we call a hybrid cloud, which is they keep some things on premise and they move some things to the cloud. And what we've really found is the costs are different. So you might not have as much hardware cost. You end up with more cloud costs. The original hype around the cloud was, you can get rid of your whole IT team, and that's where a lot of the savings was originally calculated in some of the early cloud stuff, and even stuff that was even as late as last year. And the simple fact is you're not going to get rid of your IT team when you move to cloud. You may change them. You may end up with different people with different skill sets, but there is no cost savings with this idea of you're going to just, no longer need any sort of IT department at all. And again, what Tim said there about bandwidth, a lot of our organizations were really shocked to see how much more internet bandwidth they actually needed if they were going to move certain processes to the cloud, and that was really the breaker for them. Tim, why don't we have time for one more question from the registration process, and then what we're going to do is for everyone who submitted a question during this event, we just don't have time, but we will get back to you on an individual basis, and we will give you some time to talk, and you can talk with our analysts and see if those answers make sense, and see if you have any follow-up questions and what makes is the best idea for your particular environment. So Tim, why don't we wrap it up here? I have one more question from the registration process.
Okay, and it is a pretty straightforward one. It's how much does cost management actually cost? Unfortunately, such a simple question cannot be met with such a simple answer, except to say that it is free for Azure, right? For AWS, as an example, it costs 1% of the prior month's cost after a 90-day free trial, right? So while that doesn't sound like a great deal, it's all in the numbers, right? Imagine that your organization spends, say, $100,000 per month at AWS. 1% of that $100,000 is $1,000. So when you spend more, the cost of Azure cost management also rises, right? So that would border on something of approaching unpredictability, and that is something that our financial folks kind of loathe. So with that, I'll turn it right back over. I want to thank you all for your kind attention, for your questions, and hope that the rest of your day is wonderful, 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 wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. And I just want to remind our audience, end of June is Microsoft's year end. A lot of organizations are making last-minute purchases and taking advantage of the better pricing that you can get this time of year. If you have a deal with Microsoft on the table and you're wondering if you're actually getting the best discounts, terms, and conditions that you can get, if you'd like to talk to us at Miro, we can tell you if the pricing that you're getting is good. We can tell you what you could expect to get if it's not, and we can help you review your last-minute purchases to tell you if you need any special terms and conditions. We often find that the terms and conditions could be the make or break things down the road that make a good deal or a bad deal. So with that, again, thank you for joining us. If you'd like to speak with us, please email us at sales@miroconsulting.com. Call us at 732-738-8511, or check us out online at miroconsulting.com. Again, if you had a question we didn't answer, we're going to get back to you as soon as the webinar is over. Thank you very much. Have a great day.